Hello, today is Friday, April 24th, 2020. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. A couple of weeks ago, our TC2 UK Managing Director Mark Sheard and I recorded a two-part podcast series on how to use a portfolio strategy to buy dedicated internet access, or DIA, transport. The approach we described piqued your interest, well, at least the interest of some of you, and it was apparent that you wanted to hear about how to go about contracting with multiple suppliers for dedicated internet services. Well, you're in luck because we know a few things about contracting for DIA services. In fact, we know a lot about contracting for DIA services in pretty much every service on the ICT spectrum. This podcast will be part one of a two-part series, and I'm again joined by Mark. And Mark and I are also happy to have a top attorney, Laura McDonald, join us on these two podcasts. Laura is one of LB3's senior partners and is going to help us sort through what you need to do to successfully get your contracts for DIA services. Okay, team, thanks for joining me. Mark, as I pointed out before, you're one of our evangelists for the Internet First philosophy. So why don't you recap what the contracting position will look like if an enterprise uses the portfolio strategy for buying internet transport?
Okay, Joe, and thank you once again for allowing me to come and speak to you and our public. So, after a successful RFP, an enterprise should have identified a mix of internet transport suppliers, and those transport suppliers mix will bring the best financial and performance benefits. Now, depending on the enterprise's scale, their footprint, and their specific strategy, you could be looking at 3 to 7 suppliers in that portfolio. Now, each supplier obviously must have a separate contract. Some may already have master service agreements or MSAs and a DAA internet access schedule with you. Some might have MSAs but no DIA schedule, while others are likely to be completely new partners without a contract in place. However, the status of the contract shouldn't drive the portfolio selection. This can be false economy. So, via your RFP, you got to this position. You now have solid financial positions with commitments to key requirements with each supplier. And whatever the start point is in terms of your contract, you now have to take those offers and turn them into something that's going to be useful going forward and that's going to help you take advantage of those portfolio partners. What we have to say is that doesn't need to be too onerous a process.
Okay, Laura, first, thanks for joining us today. And second, what exactly does this mean for an enterprise? I mean, what do they have to do with incumbents and with new suppliers?
Joe, that's a great question. And let's divide it as you did into the incumbent and the new suppliers. First, with an incumbent, the one who has the MSA and perhaps even has a DIA schedule already, you have to focus on making sure what was agreed upon in your RFP, all that hard work, is accurately reflected as amendments to the existing agreements. You don't want to rewrite everything unless it's in really bad shape. Assuming your MSA is in pretty good shape, you are not generally looking at significant alterations to your MSA. However, there may be some key improvements that you've secured with respect to the services, specifics of the DIA services, or key changes that were part of your RFP. For example, if part of your RFP you tried to build in provisions to reflect changes in the law, such as the California Privacy Protection Act, you may need to amend your MSA. For incumbents for the DIA schedules, one of the biggest challenges is where the supplier gives you back what you have today or they normally provide, not what you and they via their RFP responses agreed to. You have to make sure that the supplier doesn't seek to use this as an opportunity to dilute other key terms that you've secured in the past.
Well, there's a surprise. You're saying that the contract drafts that these suppliers send might not reflect what they offered in the RFP?
I know, amazing. Exactly. It's actually quite common for the supplier contract drafting team or the supplier lawyer in the background to not fully reflect the details of the RFP response. They often don't have the communication you'd want them to have with the RFP team. In fact, don't be surprised if the supplier just sends you a form contract instead of customizing it to meet the agreed upon deal. Quite often, you have to help educate them on what they committed to. And assuming that you've been diligent in your RFP process, the last thing you want to have happen is to have what you work to obtain nullified by a form contract. For an incumbent provider with the MSA, but who is not providing DIA services today, it's about getting them to provide an appropriate new DIA schedule following the same caveats and in line with your other negotiated terms. You may also need to make some modifications to some of your other schedules. For example, if you're moving from an MPLS model, you will need to make sure you have the right to terminate those services without liability in order to move to your new DIA services. And that would go for any access as well.
Now, the three of us, we know that negotiating a solid MSA, it's a real time commitment, but absolutely worth the effort. Is it any different on how to approach buying DIA from a new supplier?
Joe, for the non-incumbent, i.e. your new partner, the DIA services can be more straightforward in the sense that these guys are seeking a new relationship and they rightly feel both more vulnerable and are generally more accommodating. But that's to a point. That also doesn't mean that you're not going to get some of the same disconnects with a new supplier that you have with your incumbent that we just discussed. That is, getting a contract that reflects what they agreed to in the RFP. For the MSA, you are starting from fresh, and you'll likely want to lead on the MSA drafting in order to align it what you've already negotiated or what your company requirements are, because their forms are always most favorable to them. You'll want to spend time on the MSA, not only to protect yourselves, but also so that the next go around, if they're the incumbent, you won't have to go through all of this again. That being said, while you may want to take the lead on the MSA, it's typically okay to ask them to draft the DIA schedule, which is more product given. The other thing to keep in mind is that most suppliers, and this goes for both incumbent and new suppliers, they have online terms or service guides. If you haven't already reviewed them, review them before you review their paper. They contain good, informative information, descriptions, but they also contain a lot of terms that are unfriendly to customers. And if you don't address them in your negotiated agreement, then you implicitly agree to them.
I think also, I'll just interrupt, it's worth noting here that if you do have challenges with suppliers actually reflecting contractually what they committed to in the RFP, if you then point those things out to the bid team and the account team, they do generally want to help you resolve those problems and try to get those things in. It's also worth noting that while it shouldn't drive selection, successful contract closure should always, in effect, be part of that final selection. And what I mean by that is you select on the basis of the analysis on the offers and what they've actually committed to. But for your portfolio approach does allow you to minimize the impact of actually a supplier not really complying in the contract closure phase. So you can help ensure the right behaviors in being reasonable in that contract closure phase.
So, Mark, what are some of the key things to focus on?
Well, I think Laura and I are both in favor of focusing on what matters actually, the important things. Some of the important items I would draw out from the product and financial deal perspective would be provisioning and availability SLAs and remedies, simplicity around the credit payments and having those automated and not something that's onerous for you to undertake, the specific billing obligations that you will have, including payment terms, etc. Inclusion of the offer pricing, and that's important. While in a portfolio you might not select all the circuits from that supplier, conclusion of that information provides a great point of reference. Really important is clarity on the 12-month individual circuit terms. We're shifting the model here from term-based commitments that you have with MPLS deals in the past. And to that point, you don't need minimum term commitments and you don't need annual revenue commitments. You can get perfectly good deals without any of those sort of commitments.
Okay, Laura, I'm sure you have a meaty list of T's and C's, so let's pick up part 2 of this podcast series with that list. In the meantime, if you have questions about contracting for internet services and you would like to discuss them with Laura, Mark, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues, please give us a call or drop us an email. And you can also stay current by checking out our websites, subscribing to our podcasts, or by following us on LinkedIn.